Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to News from the Torah. I am Leah Roney. Today is the 26th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan, and June 6, 2021. This week we're reading the Torah portion of Korach, which tells us a very troubling story of a leadership crisis in the Jewish people. A Levite by the name of Korach, Moshe's own cousin, is challenging the leadership of Moshe and Aaron by claiming that they're grabbing power and playing out nepotism, and that God never told Moses to nominate Aaron as the priest. So it's very interesting that as we're reading this story about the challenge to Moshe's leadership here in Israel, in 2021, we are going through a leadership crisis of our own. After 4 inconclusive elections, and after Benjamin Netanyahu was not able to create a government during the 28-day mandate that he got from the president, the mandate went over to his opponent, Yair Lapid, and Lapid has apparently been able to cobble together a patchwork government of right-wing, left-wing, centrist, and Arab parties that have only one thing in common. They all hate Netanyahu and want him to go. And in fact, they hate him so much that they're willing to give the premiership, the prime minister's post, to Naftali Bennett, a person who has only gotten 6 seats in the Knesset. That's under 200,000 votes. They hate Netanyahu so much that they're willing to give it away to Bennett to be able to take over the government. And here all the analysts are in agreement that this government is not likely to survive more than 3 to 6 months. But even for 3 to 6 months, it is worth for this patchwork of parties to get into power. So we're going to talk about leadership and power on this show, looking at it through the prism of this Torah story of Korach and our own crisis of leadership here in Israel. Stay tuned.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back. So, as we said in the introduction, this week's Torah portion, Korach, is all about infighting and leadership challenges. To recap, Korach was Moshe's cousin. He was part of the tribe of Levi, and he was part of the Kehati family that was responsible for carrying the holy vessels of the tabernacle. So out of all the Leviim, out of all the Levites, Korach's family had the most prestigious assignment to carry the actual vessels of the tabernacle, as opposed to the other 2 families that carried the peripheral structural components of the tabernacle. So this challenge to Moshe's leadership comes after 2 other challenges in the previous 2 Torah portions. 2 weeks ago, Moshe's own sister, Miriam, challenged his leadership when she suggested that he is a prophet just like her and just like her brother Aaron. Moshe left his wife Zipporah after God gave the Torah, and when Miriam found out about it, she told Aaron, how come Moshe left his wife? We are prophets just like his, and we're not leaving our partners, so what makes him think he should leave his wife? Miriam's primary role in life was to preserve the integrity of the Jewish family. That is what she has been doing since the day she was born. So she was quite concerned about the role model, the example Moshe was setting by leaving his wife. But the fact that she compared her own level of prophecy, her brother's level of prophecy, to that of Moses, who the Rambam tells us is the greatest prophet who ever lived. And the difference between his prophecy and all other prophets is not quantitative, it's qualitative. So that was the challenge to his leadership, the fact that she did not understand just how holy he was and how he was at a different level of prophecy that has never and was never and would never be reached by any other human being. So after that internal, private challenge inside the family, during last week's Torah portion, there is a more public challenge to Moshe's leadership when 12 spies go out to spy the land, and they come back and they challenge Moshe's and God's ability to lead the Jewish people into the land of Israel. And in a way, they stage a rebellion by telling the Jewish people that they should all go back to Egypt and not proceed to the Holy Land. So that was the second challenge to Moshe's leadership, much more public one, but it was not directly targeting Moshe, it was targeting the whole issue of entering the land of Israel. In this week's Torah portion, Korach, once again Moshe's cousin, challenges Moshe personally. Korach comes out and tells Moshe that he has taken leadership and he has taken the priesthood for his brother Aaron, not by God's command, but a side of nepotism. Korach tells Moshe and Aaron that they usurped power and they are not, in fact, letting all of the Jewish people who are all holy to have opportunities for influence. Korach wraps this entire challenge into ideological statements, but our sages tell us clearly that it was all personal. Korach wanted power because his cousin Elitzaphan was nominated as the head of the Kehati family. Elitzaphan and Korach were both Moshe's cousins, but Korach came from an older brother and Elitzaphan came from a younger brother. And Korach considered it was to be his right to be the head of the Kehati family. But God commanded Moses to give the leading role to Elitzaphan, the younger cousin. And Korach saw himself being rejected and he wanted his power back. So why did he wait until this point in Jewish history to do that? Why didn't he challenge that nomination earlier? Because the Jewish people were on their way to the land of Israel, and Korach was sure there was just a matter of days until they would enter the land of Israel, and this whole power thing wouldn't really not be so relevant. Everyone would go and live on their own plot of land. But now that the Jewish people are going to be spending 40 years in desert, this leadership role all of a sudden becomes much more relevant. And this is why now Korach is coming out and challenging Moshe's nomination. Now it's important to remember that, like we said, Korach was part of the Tzar family, and they had the most responsible task in the tabernacle of taking care of the holy vessels, as opposed to two other families who had more perfunctory roles. And still, that was not enough for Korach. It was not enough for Korach to be part of the Levite family, the family that was serving in the tabernacle. It was not enough that out of that family he had the most prestigious job. He wanted power. He wanted leadership. And as our sages tell us, when we accuse other people of doing something negative, it's usually a reflection back on ourselves. When you use your hand to point a finger at somebody else, you're pointing 3 fingers back at yourself. So Korach was accusing Moshe and Aaron of power grab and nepotism, but in fact, he was the one who was guilty of trying to grab power. He was the one who is power hungry. The Torah tells us clearly 2 weeks ago that Moshe was the most humble person ever alive. He was completely unconcerned with his own power, with his own leadership, with his own needs. In fact, back in the book of Exodus, before the Jewish people left Egypt, at the burning bush, when God asked Moshe to go down to Egypt and lead the Jewish people out, Moses said, "No way, no how. I don't want that job." And he spent 7 days arguing with God about nominating somebody else to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt. He was not looking for leadership. God sort of made him, forced him to assume leadership. And why was Moses so concerned about not becoming a leader? Because he did not want to slight his older brother Aaron. If you remember, Moses was not with the Jewish people most of the time in Egypt. At first, he was brought up in a royal castle, and then he ran off to Midian to escape being killed by Pharaoh. The person who was leading the Jewish people in Egypt was Aaron. So Moshe said to God, Aaron has been the person to lead the Jewish people the entire time they were in Egypt, and he should be the one who should be leading them out of Egypt. It makes no sense for me to glide in and be a leader all of a sudden. Aaron has been carrying the mantle of leadership this whole time. He should be the one to lead them out of Egypt. And God says, don't worry about Aaron. He's going to come out to greet you, and I know that in his heart, he is happy to see you assume leadership. Instead of Aaron being jealous or being hurt or being slighted, he's actually happy to see you become a leader because he's not in it for himself, just like you are. Neither one of you is looking for a leadership role. Neither one of you is looking for power. You're both happy to have the job be done by the past person involved. So when Korach accused Moshe and Aaron of grabbing power and nepotism, he was pointing at the wrong people. And he was really just reflecting more about himself and not about Moshe and Aaron. So there's an important leadership lesson here that we're learning. Leadership is all about service. And Jewish leadership is all about humility and serving the people you're meant to serve. It's not about power. It's not about influence. It's not about prestige. In fact, the way that God has tested Jewish leaders, Moses and David later on, was to see how they would treat their sheep. They were both shepherds, and when a little sheep would wander off and get lost, both Moshe and David would go out and find the little sheep and take care of it and bring it back and make sure that it stays with the flock, that it doesn't get hurt. They were really concerned with the people they were leading. They were out there to do the best for the people. And we see that Moses' first reaction upon hearing about Korach was praying for the Jewish people, his concern, not for himself, not for his leadership and the challenge to him personally, but for the fallout that this might create for the Jewish people after the previous sins that have befallen the nation. And that's the hallmark of Jewish leadership, really not taking care about yourself, not looking for power, not looking for influence, but thinking, how will this influence the people that I'm dealing with? And I want to wrap off this segment with a story about Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, one of the first chief rabbis in the land of Israel. Rabbi Kook was already older and he was sick, and somebody decided to take care of his health and hung on his door a sign with visiting hours. And a few hours later, that sign was gone. So that member of the household hung another sign, and a few hours later, that sign was gone. And he came to complain to Rabbi Kook about how people are so rude, they're taking down the visiting hour sign. And Rabbi Kook said, I took down the sign. So this member of the household says, how come, Rabbi, you don't want to have visiting hours? Rabbi Kook says, I don't have visiting hours. I'm a servant. I'm a servant of God's holy people. And servants of God's holy people don't have visiting hours. I'm here for my people whenever they need me, for whatever they need me. And this is really the hallmark of Jewish leadership, being there for the people you serve. We will discuss more about this, more about the current crisis of leadership in Israel, right after these messages.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
So, as we're reading about the crisis of leadership in the Torah 3,000 years ago, today Israel is undergoing a crisis of leadership of its own. We have not had a stable government for over 2 years. We have had 4 rounds of elections that have been inconclusive, and after Prime Minister Netanyahu failed to create a government, now an anti-Bibi coalition, an anti-Netanyahu coalition of parties from right, left, and center are trying to create their own. It's not yet clear if they will succeed. I want to talk about this new leadership crisis, and I'd like to start with a story from about 250 years back. After Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezhebush, the Baal Shem Tov's primary student, passed away, all of his students got together to figure out who would be the next leader of the Hasidic movement. At this meeting, different rabbis proposed different candidates for the post of the leader of the Hasidic movement. And at one point, one of the people there, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Zlotchov, got up and started explaining why he would be the best candidate for the position of leadership. And he continued that speech for 2 hours, explaining why he was the best possible candidate. After the meeting was dispersed, Rabbi Yechiel Michal's primary opponent, Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, a person with who they had real, true ideological differences, traveled around the area, and he came to the Rabbi of Apta. Now, the Rabbi of Apta heard the story about Rabbi Yechiel Michal's 2-hour-long monologue about why he was the best person to lead, and he asked Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz what was going on there. Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, who once again was Rabbi Yechiel Michal's opponent, said, "Listen, I have never in my life seen such humility as when Rabbi Yechiel Michal explained why he was the best person to lead the Hasidic movement. It was a true lesson in humility." So to all of us, this sounds very counterintuitive. Humility to us does not mean getting up and talking for 2 hours why I am the best person for the leadership slot. And I think we need to understand what is humility to be able to understand what is Jewish leadership. And through that prism, look at what's happening right now in Israeli politics. Humility does not mean that you do not value yourself. Humility does not mean that you're not the best person for the job. Humility does not mean that you do not understand the gifts that you have. Jewish humility means that you understand that everything you have is not yours. It is God's gift to you to give over to serve other people. This is humility. When you don't take credit for your accomplishments, when you do not assign those accomplishments to your smarts, to your wisdom, to your ability, to your connections, when you understand that really all we're doing in this world is an effort, and God is the one who creates results. So any accomplishments we have, yes, we might have worked hard for them, but in the end, without God giving us the raw materials, the intellect, the talents, the abilities, the families we were born in, without those gifts from God, nothing would have happened. And it's very popular and fashionable today to talk about privilege and checking your privilege. Well, guess what? We're all privileged. We're all privileged with something. Yes, many of us are privileged to be born into families that saw it important to give us education. And yes, many of us are privileged to be born into families of certain socioeconomic level. And many of us were privileged to be born into families with a love of learning that was passed on to us. And many of us were privileged with talents. But every single person in this world is privileged in some way or another. And it is searching out that privilege, finding that edge, finding those gifts that God bestowed upon us, giving God thanks and gratitude for those gifts, recognizing them, and then making the best use of them for the service of God's world. This is true humility. And just like if you don't understand that you have some tools in your toolbox, you cannot do the job. If you don't understand the gifts that you've gotten from God, you cannot do the job. So if you were to go to a plumber and he would say, well, I can't do the job. I don't have this and this tool. You would say, well, open your box. It's right there. He's like, oh, yeah. You would have thought, what's wrong with this guy? You wouldn't have thought that he is humble because he doesn't think he has a tool in his box. So why do you think it is smart to deny your own gifts? If you deny your own gifts, you in fact denied God's handiwork. And one of the leading thinkers of the past 100 years, Rabbi Dessler, said that if you do not realize your shortcomings, you're like a carpenter who doesn't have wood to work with. But if you do not realize your gifts, you're like a carpenter who doesn't have any tools to work with. Your shortcomings, the material, the things that you're supposed to work on to make something out of. But your gifts are God's gift to you to use in this world. So now that we understand that this is humility, we also need to understand that every single person in this world has a place of leadership. Every one of us has something special that only they can accomplish. And from there, they have to lead. But what separates a humble person from a boastful person is the understanding that it's not about me. It is not about my power. It is not about my gain, just like we discussed in the first segment about Moses. And this is where it gets relevant to us. Everybody understands that the current attempt at coalition, the current government, is about one thing. It's about overthrowing Netanyahu. This is the only thing that this coalition has in common. And in fact, they do not deny it. They're quite frankly, they say it all the time, and it's called the change government. It's a government to bring change, and the only change it's going to bring is overthrow Netanyahu and create a vacuum of leadership. Now, Netanyahu is a very flawed individual, just like every individual is flawed. We're all flawed people, and Netanyahu is certainly not perfect, and he has his own flaws. He is a brilliant politician, but he has his flaws as an individual, and he also has his flaws as a statesman, and there are many things he could have done in the past 10 years that he did not do. Having said that, as soon as you have a coalition that is all about the people and not about the issues, that is making everything personal, we know right away that this is not a coalition founded on leadership and is not a coalition founded on humility. It's a coalition founded on personal interests and personal hate. And we know from the Torah that when things are founded on boastfulness, on jealousy, on hate, on power, they never succeed. God says in numerous places throughout the Torah and throughout the teachings of our sages that a person who is proud cannot stay in the same abode as God. God and pride cannot stay in the same abode because pride is all about me. It's all about concentrating on what I did, what I can, what I am able to succeed, about my power and my abilities. And as soon as we concentrate on ourselves, we automatically reject God. You cannot be in an ego state and a God state at the same time. In fact, ego is the core of our evil inclination. Our personal egos are exactly the space that is antithetical to God consciousness. So ego consciousness and God consciousness cannot stay in the same abode, cannot stay in the same place. And anywhere that is egocentric means that God is being rejected. And when God is not there, it's not going to be successful. So we already know that this coalition is not going to be successful because it is all about egos. It's not about issues. It's not about ideology. It's not about common programs that these different parties want to forward. It's all about getting one person out of that seat, and that one person is Netanyahu. So like I said, Netanyahu is not perfect, and there could be many challenges to his leadership, and there could be many leaders who are better than he is. But it has to be based on issues. It has to be based on ideologies. It has to be based on the vision for the country, not on personalities. And in fact, this is a litmus test. Anytime somebody attacks you personally, or anytime you see people attacking other people personally, not about issues, not about the ideas, not about the ideologies, but personally, just saying that you're a bad person, or you're an unworthy person, or you're a power-grabbing person, or you're holding onto the chair, you know that the person who is making those accusations, once again, as he's pointing one finger at the other, he's pointing three fingers back at himself. So this coalition that now includes right-wing religious parties like Bennett Semina and right-wing anti-religious parties like Avigdor Lieberman's party, and then midway parties like Blue and White led by Gantz, and then far left-wing parties like Meretz, and even an Arab party that is actually a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the ideological brothers of Hamas. Okay, when these parties come together, parties that really are motley crew, have nothing in common, you know that it's not about issues, and it's certainly not about common vision. It's all about ego and pride. And where ego and pride take central stage, God is absent. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
And welcome back. So as we're discussing leadership in this week's show, I'm wondering if some of you may be thinking that this is not relevant to you. After all, you're saying, I'm not a leader, so leadership is great for other people, but it has really nothing to do with me. And as we said in the previous segment, that's not true. God has created each and every one of us as a leader. We all have something unique to contribute that only we can. And the Slonimer Rebbe writes that after 120 years on this earth, every person will go up to God to be judged. And in addition to being judged for learning Torah, for doing good deeds, for performing the commandments, God will also judge us on whether we performed our singular, unique, divine, God-given mission. Now, I know that none of us came with instruction manuals, and you might not know what that mission is, but it is fairly simple to find out. I've been doing that for people and with people for the past decade. It's the place where the things that you love doing, the things that you're really good at, and the things that the community around you needs, the place where those three things intersect, that's your special power. That's your life mission. And this is what God will ask you about after 120 years. We're all here to serve. And when we serve others, we'll lead them. We'll lead them, people, to help them to get to places where they want to get. So on this level, we're all leaders. And to be those leaders, we need to recognize our leadership qualities. We need to stop hiding behind our armor. Stop staying in our safe spots. Stop being non-vulnerable and show up. Because yes, leadership takes courage, and leadership takes vulnerability, and leadership takes being able to take criticism, and leadership means understanding that you're not perfect, and leadership means you know that you will mess up sometimes, but it is still all okay, because what you're doing is performing service for God. And what you really need to be a leader is just show up. If you show up and you are willing to take upon yourself this mission that God has given you, you can be sure that He will lead you and He will make sure that you get it done. So this is one aspect of leadership that is relevant to every single one of us. But this week's Torah portion teaches us another aspect of leadership that is less common, that people pay less attention to. And that is that the real leaders are actually the people behind the leaders. And working with numerous organizations and consulting to numerous organizations, I know that the real influencers, the real leaders are not the people in the spotlight. It's the people behind the scenes who consult to the leader, who help him, who encourage him, who show him the way, who are his think tank. Those are the real leaders. Those are people who are really making the difference. And this is something that this week's Torah portion teaches us. Our sages ask what happened that made Korach challenge Moshe's leadership. And on the flip side, they noticed that there was one of the leaders of the rebellion against Moses, a guy by the name On ben Peled, who somewhere in the middle of the Torah portion just disappears and is never mentioned again. So the Torah asks, why did Korach think of this rebellion? And on the flip side, what happened to this guy On ben Peled? And the answer the Torah gives is that it was all about their wives. So the wives here really represent the person behind the scene, the person who is influencing the leader, and every leader has somebody who's influencing them, the inner circle. So our sages tell us that Korach was actually extremely wealthy, but no matter what he had, it was never enough for his wife. And she kept nagging him to go against Moshe because she had this developed political understanding, and she was thinking that Moses was grabbing more and more power, and she wanted that power for her own family. So she was nagging Korach, look, Moses, he took the leadership, and his brother Aaron, he has the priesthood, and the two sons of Aaron are the assistant priests. And they take the Truma donation to themselves, and so on and so on. And then when God told Moses to shave the Levites as part of their dedication, she said, look what he did to you. He got you to shave yourself and to look ridiculous. But Korach said, but Moses is also a Levite, and he also shaved. He said, yeah, for sure. He is willing to shave himself in order to ridicule you. So after nagging him day in and day out, some of her nagging actually went to Korach's head, and he started this rebellion against Moses. On the other hand, we're told that one of Korach's followers, his name was On ben Pelet. He was from the family of Reuven. And while he's mentioned in the beginning as one of the leaders of the rebellion, then he disappears. So the sages notice that and ask how come. And then they bring the story. On ben Pelet was one of the leaders of the rebellion, and when he came home, his wife said, "What do you care? It doesn't matter who wins. If Moses wins, you're still a nobody. And if Korach wins, you're still a nobody. Doesn't matter who wins, you will still be a follower. Your personal prestige will not rise. So what do you care? What do you have in this game? What skin do you have in this game? Why is it worth your while to be part of this debate?" And On said, "Yes, that's true, but I've already committed myself. I can't get out of this. My honor is on the line. I've promised Korach to back him up." So his wife said, "You know what? Let me take care of it." And she set him down to a meal, and she gave him some wine, and basically he became inebriated and went to sleep. And she sat by the entrance to the tent and started brushing her hair. Now, hair is considered to be something that's kept private between husband and wife, and as part of Jewish law, women do not show up with their hair uncovered in public. So when Korach and his followers came to On's tent to call him and get him to join them against Moses, all of a sudden they came across his wife, who was sitting there with her hair uncovered and brushing her hair, and they were very pious, quote unquote. So they ran off and left On alone. And this is how On was spared the destiny of all the other followers of Korach, because when they all experienced the downfall and was swallowed by the earth, On was actually spared by his wife's wisdom. And about this story, the sages say that a wise woman will build up her house, and a stupid woman will bring her own downfall. So I think the two important points here, one is more of a gender point, and another one is relevant to everybody. I think we all have tremendous power in our hands, and I think the sages underline the tremendous influence that we as women have on the people around us, on our husbands, on our children, on people at work. Women have this very unique ability to see to the needs of other people. They have the ability to intuitively understand what people around them need and want, and then play that up. Korach's wife saw that her husband was very proud and egocentric, and she played into that by boasting his ego, by boasting his pride. And in the end, unfortunately, by playing up her husband's ego and pride, she really brought her house down. While on the other hand, On's wife understood that really her husband had nothing to gain from this whole story, and she knew how to navigate the terrain without going out into a full-blown conflict, how to get him out in a way that still preserved his honor, that did not require him to go against his own commitment. But she helped him to get out of this commitment that was not good for him. But then beyond the gender issue, we're all in places of influence. We're all close to people who are leaders. And that could be your manager at work. It could be a community leader. It could be a rabbi at a synagogue. We all have leaders around us. And I think every single one of us is surrounded by leaders. Even a teacher in class is a leader. So we all have leaders around us. And even if you don't see yourself as a leader, even if you don't see yourself as capable of leadership, I think you can identify people of leadership around you and understand that you have tremendous influence on them. Leaders are lonely. They need somebody to run things by. They need somebody to help them process their emotions. And by being there next to the leader, influencing leaders from behind the curtain, so to speak, you can have tremendous influence on how things are happening. So I want you to think for a minute of people in leadership positions whom you can gently influence to make the right decisions. I'm sure you can think of somebody, and I'm sure you can think of ways that you can change the reality in your place of work, in your community, in your synagogue, by influencing leaders gently to do the right thing, not going out into full-blown conflict like Korach's wife wanted, but gently influencing them to make the right decision, the way On Ben Pellet's wife did. And if we are committed to doing the right thing, if we're committed to making the world a better place, if we understand that we're placed at these critical junctions by God to play out our influence to serve other people, and we do this with prayer, then God will always help us do the right thing. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope it was useful for you. And I hope by the end of the show you have found some way to influence the surroundings around you in a better place. I hope to see you again next week on News from the Torah. Bye-bye.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.